June 1944. Before dawn. A thin mist hangs over the English Channel, blurring the line between sea and sky. The water is restless but controlled, its surface broken by steel hulls moving without lights. Far across the Channel, the Normandy coast lies quiet, villages dark, beaches empty, bunkers manned by soldiers who expect another false alarm. Inside German concrete casemates, officers sip coffee and glance at watches. Reports from the night speak of scattered parachutes, confused landings, nothing coherent. To many, it feels familiar. Another Allied diversion, another American rehearsal mistaken for ambition. For years, German planners have dismissed the Americans as industrial giants, but military novices, loud, predictable, slow. They believe real danger still lies elsewhere, across the Pas-de-Calais, where maps and doctrine insist the blow must fall. The Atlantic Wall stands as proof of confidence poured into concrete. Guns face the sea, orders are rigid, reserves remain locked behind permission that has not yet come. Then, the horizon begins to change. Low shapes appear where open water should be. The sound arrives next. Not thunder, but something heavier, something continuous. And in that moment, certainty begins to fracture, giving way to the long road that led both sides here.
By the spring of 1944, the war in Europe had entered a decisive phase. Germany still occupied vast stretches of the continent, but the strategic balance had shifted. In the east, the Wehrmacht was bleeding under the weight of the Red Army's relentless pressure. Entire German formations had been shattered at Stalingrad and Kursk, their losses irreplaceable. In the south, Allied forces had landed in Italy, forcing Germany to fight uphill through terrain that consumed men and materiel. Yet in the west, there was an uneasy calm. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, these lands had been under German control since 1940. For 4 years, the Channel coast had waited. The long-anticipated Allied return had not yet come, and each passing month reinforced a dangerous belief inside German headquarters that if the invasion had not happened yet, it would come only on German terms. To guard this coastline, Adolf Hitler ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall. Stretching from northern Norway to the Bay of Biscay, it was less a continuous wall than a patchwork of fortifications. Concrete bunkers, gun emplacements, minefields, steel obstacles driven into sand and surf. On maps and inspection tours it looked formidable. On paper it promised certainty. But reality was uneven. Many fortifications were incomplete. Some coastal divisions were under strength, manned by older soldiers, convalescents, or conscripts from occupied territories. Equipment varied wildly. Ammunition stocks were often limited. Mobility was restricted by fuel shortages and Allied air power that made daylight movement hazardous. Still, German doctrine emphasized defense in depth and rapid counterattack. The belief was simple: any landing force could be thrown back into the sea if reserves moved quickly enough. And that belief depended on one crucial assumption. German high command was convinced that the main Allied landing would come at the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. It was logical: shortest crossing, direct route to Germany's industrial heartland. German intelligence assessments, reinforced by years of staff studies, pointed there again and again. Normandy, by comparison, seemed unlikely. Its beaches were wider, its ports smaller, its road network less direct. To many German officers, it appeared a secondary option, useful perhaps for a diversion, but not for a decisive blow. This assumption shaped everything. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander in the West, believed reserves should be held back, centralized, ready to counterattack once the main invasion site was confirmed. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with inspecting and strengthening coastal defenses, believed the opposite.
Allied air superiority, he argued, would paralyze movement inland. The enemy had to be crushed at the waterline in the first hours, or not at all. Their disagreement was never resolved. Above them stood Hitler, whose micromanagement froze decision-making. Panzer divisions were held under his direct control. Orders to move required permission that could not be granted if he was asleep, absent, or unconvinced. In theory, this preserved strategic flexibility. In practice, it created paralysis. Compounding this was a cultural underestimation of the enemy. Many German officers had fought the British and French in 1940 and come away with deep respect for their professionalism. The Americans, however, were different in German eyes. They were newcomers, wealthy, industrial, loud. Their early setbacks in North Africa reinforced a stereotype of clumsy leadership and predictable methods. German war diaries and private correspondence often reflected a quiet contempt. The Americans would bring numbers, not finesse. What German planners underestimated was what those numbers meant when paired with time, planning, and total mobilization. Across the Channel, an entirely different kind of war preparation was underway, one that did not rely on brilliance or speed, but on scale, redundancy, and patience. And as German assumptions hardened into certainty, the stage was being set for a collision between belief and reality, a collision that would soon narrow its focus to a stretch of coastline long dismissed as improbable.
While German commanders debated where and when the invasion would come, the Allied war machine was moving with quiet determination. By early 1944, the Western Allies had committed themselves to a single objective, opening a permanent front in Northwest Europe. The operation was named OVERLORD, and it represented the largest amphibious assault ever planned. At its center stood General Dwight D. Eisenhower, appointed Supreme Allied Commander. Eisenhower was not a battlefield tactician in the traditional sense. His strength lay elsewhere, in coordination, patience, and the management of vast competing egos. British, American, Canadian, and Free French forces all fell under his command. Success depended less on daring maneuvers and more on flawless synchronization. Planning for Overlord began long before the first soldier boarded a landing craft. Every detail was studied, argued, revised, and studied again. Tides, moon phases, weather patterns, beach gradients, soil composition, road access, and enemy fortifications were all analyzed with methodical precision. Where certainty was impossible, contingency replaced optimism. American planning culture played a decisive role. The United States approached war as an engineering problem. If a challenge existed, it could be solved through preparation, resources, and repetition. Training exercises along the British coast ran endlessly. Units practiced embarkation and debarkation until muscle memory replaced hesitation. Mistakes were documented, not hidden. Failure in rehearsal was treated as insurance against catastrophe in combat. Logistics became the quiet obsession of the Allied command. Millions of tons of supplies, fuel, ammunition, food, medical equipment were stockpiled across southern England. Entire ports were expanded or built from scratch. Roads were reinforced. Rail networks were restructured to move men and material toward embarkation points. Nothing was left to improvisation once the invasion began. The problem of ports was especially critical. The Allies knew they could not rely on capturing a major harbor intact. German demolition plans made that clear. The solution was audacious and entirely unconventional. Artificial harbors, built in sections, towed across the Channel and assembled off the beaches of Normandy. These mulberry harbors were not theoretical. They were constructed, tested, dismantled, and reconstructed in British waters until engineers were satisfied they would work under fire. Air power provided the other pillar of Allied confidence. By 1944, the Luftwaffe in the West had been worn down. Allied fighters and bombers dominated the skies, striking rail yards, bridges, radar stations, and coastal batteries. These attacks were not random. They were part of a systematic effort to isolate the battlefield before a single soldier landed. German reinforcements would be delayed not by enemy fire, but by the absence of intact infrastructure. To protect all of this, the Allies built a deception as elaborate as the invasion itself. Operation Fortitude created an entirely fictitious army group in southeast England. Inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, false radio traffic, and double agents fed German intelligence a steady diet of misinformation. The notional commander of this phantom force was General George S. Patton, a figure the Germans respected and feared. Every signal pointed to the Pas-de-Calais. German intelligence did not simply accept this deception, they embraced it. It confirmed what they already believed. As a result, divisions that might have reinforced Normandy were held back. Reserves remained positioned for a landing that would never come. Even as late as June 6, German commanders hesitated to commit forces fully, convinced that Normandy might still be a feint. What German officers mistook for American predictability was in truth American patience. Planning had not been rushed, it had been layered. Where Germans saw rigidity, the Allies had built redundancy. Where Germans trusted doctrine, the Allies trusted preparation. By the night of June 5, 1944, more than 150,000 men were moving toward the Channel. Thousands of ships assembled beyond the horizon. Aircraft engines warmed on darkened runways. The invasion was no longer a theory or a rehearsal. And on the far shore, along a coastline still considered unlikely, German confidence remained largely intact, unaware that the assumptions shaping their defenses were about to be tested not by a raid, but by overwhelming force.
German military culture in 1944 was built on tradition, hierarchy, and experience. Many officers defending the Atlantic Wall had spent their careers studying decisive battles of movement, encirclements, breakthroughs, rapid exploitation. Amphibious invasion on the scale the Allies were planning did not fit neatly into that intellectual framework. To these officers, the enemy across the Channel appeared methodical to the point of rigidity. American doctrine emphasized planning, checklists, and overwhelming material. German commanders, raised on Ausstrach tactic, the philosophy of decentralized initiative, interpreted this as a weakness. They believed adaptability on the battlefield would offset Allied numbers. This belief bred quiet disdain. War diaries and post-war testimonies reveal a common theme. American officers were seen as inexperienced, overly cautious, dependent on air power and artillery to compensate for a lack of tactical finesse. The assumption was that once the landing force was disrupted, once confusion set in, the Americans would falter. What this mentality overlooked was scale. Ausstrach tactic relied on competent junior leadership and fluid communication. By 1944, Germany's officer corps had been thinned by years of attrition. Replacements were younger, less trained, and often unfamiliar with their units. The doctrine remained, but the human structure that sustained it had eroded. Still, confidence persisted. Orders were followed, bunkers were manned, and the belief that Normandy was secondary remained largely unchallenged within the German chain of command. Across the Channel, American commanders approached the invasion without romanticism. They did not expect brilliance to win the day. They expected friction, chaos, and loss. Their answer was not elegance, but insurance. Every plan had a backup. Every backup had another behind it. Landing schedules accounted for missed beaches, broken radios, lost officers. Units trained to continue forward even if leadership was cut down. Naval gunfire plans were layered so that failure in one sector would be compensated by weight elsewhere. This approach appeared plotting to German observers. It was anything but. It was a form of resilience built into the structure itself. American commanders understood something crucial. Modern war punished perfectionism. It rewarded systems that could absorb failure and continue functioning.
The invasion plan did not require everything to go right. It required enough things to go right, often enough, across enough fronts. That philosophy would matter most when the landings went wrong, which many of them did. German defenses emphasized static strength, concrete, steel, fixed guns. These were formidable but inflexible. The Allies, by contrast, treated technology as a means of movement. Landing craft came in dozens of designs, each suited to a specific task. Tanks were modified to swim, bridge gaps, or clear mines. Engineers carried equipment that turned beaches into roads within hours. Most important was logistics. Supplies did not arrive in waves, they flowed continuously. Ammunition followed infantry, fuel followed armor, medical evacuation followed injury. German planners underestimated this entirely. They assumed that even if the Allies landed, sustaining them would be impossible without a port. They did not fully appreciate that the Allies had planned to bring the port with them. For German soldiers stationed along the Normandy coast, life in early June 1944 felt routine. Drills, watch rotations, occasional air raids inland. Many had been there for months without seeing combat. Some units were composed of veterans, others were filled with conscripts, foreign volunteers, or men recovering from wounds. Morale varied, but expectations were low. Most believed any major invasion would come elsewhere. On the evening of June 5th, many officers were absent. Some attended exercises, others were away on leave. One division commander was in Germany for war games, another was celebrating a birthday. The coast was guarded, but not alert. And as night settled over Normandy, the first signs that something was wrong appeared not on the beaches, but in the sky, where distant aircraft engines began to echo across fields and hedgerows long before the sea revealed what was coming next.
At the heart of Germany's western defense was an unresolved argument. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, charged with strengthening the Atlantic Wall, believed the war would be decided in the first hours of an invasion. Allied air superiority, he warned, would make large-scale maneuver impossible once the enemy was ashore. The only chance was to destroy the landing force on the beaches. Rommel ordered obstacles placed in the surf, mines buried in sand, and stakes driven into fields to impale gliders. He pushed for armor to be stationed near the coast, ready to strike immediately. Rundstedt disagreed. He believed any initial landing would be a diversion. The true blow, he argued, would come later and elsewhere. Armor had to be held back, preserved for a decisive counterstroke once the enemy revealed his main effort. Hitler sided with neither completely and with both enough to paralyze action. Panzer divisions were split in authority. Some answered to Rommel, others to Hitler directly. Their release required approval that could not be granted quickly. The result was hesitation built into the system. When speed was required, procedure intervened. This was not incompetence, it was structure, and on June 6th, structure would become fate. The first German reports in the early hours of June 6th were confused. Paratroopers had landed inland, communications were cut, small engagements erupted in unexpected places. Many officers interpreted this as harassment, not invasion. When naval gunfire began along the coast, the scale was difficult to comprehend. Some batteries fired back bravely, only to be silenced within minutes. Others waited for orders that never came. As the morning progressed, messages grew more urgent. This was not a raid. This was not a feint. Units requested reinforcements that could not move. Roads were cratered. Bridges lay in ruins. Allied aircraft dominated every attempt at daylight movement. German officers, who once mocked American planning, now faced an enemy that seemed everywhere at once. For the French civilians of Normandy, the invasion was both liberation and catastrophe. Allied bombing had already taken a heavy toll in the months leading up to D-Day. Towns were damaged, civilians were killed. Resentment and hope existed side by side. On June 6th, villages became battlefields. Homes were destroyed,
Families fled cellars as fighting swept through hedgerows and streets. The moral complexity of liberation was immediate and unavoidable. German soldiers, often billeted among civilians, fought and retreated through places that were not abstract objectives but lived-in spaces. The war was no longer distant, it was intimate. Perhaps the most decisive angle was psychological. German officers had built their defense on assumptions about where the enemy would land, how he would fight, how quickly he would falter. As reports accumulated, those assumptions failed one by one. The Americans did not break when plans unraveled. They adapted, they kept landing, they kept advancing. The realization did not arrive all at once. It crept in, report by report, as the morning wore on. This was not the enemy they had prepared to dismiss. This was an enemy who had prepared for failure and built victory out of persistence. And as smoke rose over the beaches and the sea filled with ships beyond counting, the moment arrived when German commanders understood that Normandy was not a sideshow. It was the war.
The night of June 5th to June 6th, 1944, unfolded under low clouds and rising wind. Weather that had delayed the invasion now became its shield. German forecasters, confident the conditions were unsuitable for a major landing, relaxed their alerts. Some senior officers retired early. Others traveled away from their commands, convinced nothing decisive could happen before the weather cleared. Shortly after midnight, the sky over Normandy fractured. Allied aircraft crossed the coast in waves. Pathfinders dropped first, marking landing zones with lights and beacons. Then the main airborne forces followed. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions west of the Vire River, British and Canadian airborne units east of the Orne. The drops were imperfect, winds scattered aircraft, men landed miles from their intended zones, equipment was lost, units broke apart on impact. Yet the chaos worked in the Allies' favor. Small groups of paratroopers began moving toward objectives they only half recognized. Bridges were seized, roads were blocked, German communications were cut. Reports flooded headquarters, describing attacks everywhere and nowhere at once. To German commanders, this confirmed their expectations. Airborne landings had occurred before. They were dangerous but limited. Many believed these were diversionary actions meant to distract from the real invasion still to come. At coastal headquarters, requests for clarification moved slowly up the chain. Authorization to release armored reserves stalled. Hitler was asleep, and his staff hesitated to wake him without certainty. Meanwhile, offshore, the invasion fleet was closing in. Thousands of ships, transports, landing craft, destroyers, battleships moved into position. Naval guns opened fire in the early hours, sending shells inland with a violence Normandy had never known. Coastal batteries answered where they could, some scoring hits, many silenced almost immediately by concentrated bombardment. As the dawn approached, German observers began to see shapes emerging through smoke and mist. Lines of landing craft stretched across the horizon, advancing steadily toward the beaches. This was not a reconnaissance in force. This was not harassment. This was mass. Radio reports grew urgent. Commanders demanded permission to move reserves. Messages were sent and resent. Conflicting assessments arrived simultaneously. Reports of airborne attacks inland, naval bombardment along multiple beaches, and landings that appeared to be unfolding across a broad front. For the first time, doubt crept into German calculations. If this was a diversion, it was an unprecedented one. If it was the main attack, it was unfolding faster than Doctrine had anticipated. As the sun rose on June 6th, the sea off Normandy was no longer empty. It was crowded with steel and fire, and the question facing German command was no longer where the enemy would strike, but whether there was still time to stop him before the beachheads became permanent. Daylight revealed the full scale of what German planners had struggled to imagine. From Utah Beach in the west to Sword Beach in the east, Allied forces were landing along more than 50 miles of coastline. The operation was not concentrated at a single decisive point. It was deliberately broad, forcing German defenders to respond everywhere at once with forces they did not have. At Utah Beach, American troops came ashore almost by accident in the wrong sector. Strong currents pushed landing craft south of their intended zone. The error proved fortunate. German defenses there were lighter, and U.S. commanders on the ground made a rapid decision not to correct the mistake. Within hours, casualties were low, exits were secured, and the beachhead expanded inland. Omaha Beach told a different story. There, the terrain favored the defense. Bluffs overlooked narrow stretches of sand. German positions, manned by experienced units, survived the initial bombardment largely intact. American troops landed into a storm of machine gun and artillery fire. Landing craft were hit, tanks sank, units became disorganized almost immediately. For a moment, German expectations seemed validated, but the Americans did not withdraw. Small groups crawled forward, using shell craters and debris for cover. Junior officers and non-commissioned leaders took control where senior officers had fallen. Naval gunfire was redirected closer to shore, sometimes within dangerous proximity of friendly troops. Engineers blew gaps through obstacles under fire. By late morning, footholds existed atop the bluffs. Once the first positions were breached, German defenses lost their cohesion. The Atlantic Wall had been designed to stop an enemy at the water's edge. It was far less effective once the enemy moved beyond it. On the British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, progress varied, but momentum built steadily. Armored units pushed inland, airborne forces linked up with seaborne troops. The eastern flank near the Orne River was secured, denying German armor an easy avenue of counterattack. German responses remained fragmented. Requests to move panzer divisions continued to climb the chain of command. Some units moved without orders and were turned back by Allied air attacks. Others waited for authorization that came too late. When armor finally engaged, it did so piecemeal, lacking the mass required for a decisive counterstroke. By the afternoon of June 6th, the reality could no longer be denied. This was not a raid. It was not a feint. It was not an American experiment in overreach. It was a sustained invasion, supported by air, sea, and an industrial system capable of replacing losses faster than they could be inflicted. German officers who had once dismissed American planning now faced a battlefield that defied their expectations. The enemy had absorbed confusion, casualties, and failure, and continued forward regardless. As night fell, Allied troops held multiple beachheads. Supplies flowed ashore, artillery was emplaced, command posts were established. The window to throw the invaders back into the sea had closed, and with it closed the last certainty German command had carried into the day.
The first night after the landings brought no pause. Instead, it marked a shift from shock to grim calculation. Along the Normandy coast, Allied engineers worked under floodlights and intermittent fire, clearing obstacles, repairing exits, and turning beaches into supply arteries. Landing craft continued to arrive, unloading men, vehicles, artillery, and ammunition in an unbroken rhythm. The sea, once a barrier, had become a highway. German commanders spent the night assembling fragments. Units that had survived the initial bombardment regrouped inland. Communications, where they still functioned, carried orders that were increasingly defensive in tone. The ambition to annihilate the invasion force was gone. The priority now was containment, holding ground long enough to prevent a rapid Allied breakout. Casualty reports reflected the imbalance. German losses were difficult to calculate precisely in the chaos, but entire coastal units had been rendered combat ineffective within hours. Fixed gun positions were destroyed or abandoned. Command posts were overrun.
Experienced non-commissioned officers, the backbone of German field units, were lost in numbers that could not be easily replaced. Allied casualties were heavy, particularly among American forces at Omaha Beach. Thousands were killed, wounded, or missing in a single day. Yet the flow of reinforcements did not slow. Losses were absorbed into a system designed to endure them. By June 7th, the Allies had landed more than 325,000 men, along with tens of thousands of vehicles and tons of supplies. Artificial harbors began to take shape offshore. Fuel pipelines were laid beneath the channel. What German planners had believed impossible without a captured port was already happening in plain sight. Inside German headquarters, assessments grew increasingly sober. Reports acknowledged that the enemy had achieved strategic surprise, not because the invasion was unexpected, but because its scale and persistence defied previous assumptions. Normandy had been underestimated. American capability had been misjudged. Hitler ordered counterattacks, but they lacked coordination and timing. Allied air power punished every attempt at daylight movement. Roads became death traps. Columns were forced to disperse or hide, losing momentum before reaching the front. The initiative had passed. What followed was no longer a question of whether the Allies would remain in Normandy, but how quickly they could expand beyond it. The bocage country, dense hedgerows and narrow lanes favored the defender, and German forces would exploit it. But the strategic picture was set. The Western Front, long anticipated and long delayed, was now a reality, and the German officer corps, once confident in its reading of the enemy, faced a war it could no longer shape, only endure.
As the days stretched into weeks, the invasion of Normandy hardened into a battle of attrition, one that exposed the limits of German endurance. The Allies did not race inland as some planners had hoped. Instead, they advanced yard by yard through hedgerows that turned every field into a fortified position. Progress was slow, costly, and relentless. For German forces, this kind of fighting demanded resources they no longer possessed. Divisions rushed into Normandy arrived under strength and short of fuel. Replacement troops were often poorly trained. Artillery ammunition dwindled. Allied aircraft dominated the skies from dawn to dusk, striking bridges, rail lines, and road junctions with precision that improved daily. The ability to shift forces laterally, to plug gaps or exploit opportunities, evaporated. German officer reports from the period reveal a striking change in tone. Early confidence gave way to frustration, then resignation. The Americans, once mocked as tactically naive, demonstrated an ability to learn rapidly. They adapted their methods to the terrain, developed new infantry armor coordination, and applied overwhelming firepower where maneuver failed. Operation Cobra, launched in late July, marked the final collapse of German resistance in Normandy. A massive aerial bombardment shattered defensive lines near Saint-Lô. When American forces broke through, German units lacked the reserves to seal the breach. What followed was not an orderly withdrawal, but a retreat under constant pressure. The Calais pocket closed in August, trapping and destroying much of Germany's remaining strength in the west. Thousands of vehicles were abandoned. Entire formations ceased to exist. Survivors fled eastward, exhausted and disillusioned. For the German High Command, the consequences were irreversible. The myth of control in the West was shattered. The officer corps confronted a reality it had long resisted. The war could no longer be won. In Allied headquarters, there was no celebration, only urgency. Losses had been severe. Cities lay in ruins. Civilians suffered enormously. Yet the strategic objective had been achieved. A permanent Allied foothold existed on the continent. The road to Germany was open, and with every mile advanced, the memory of early mockery faded. replaced by the stark understanding that preparation, not bravado, had decided the fate of Normandy, and with it, the future of the war in Europe. Normandy was more than a battle. It was a mirror held up to the nature of modern warfare. One side relied on speed, tradition, and confidence born of past victories. The other relied on preparation, persistence, in the quiet accumulation of advantages, numbers, logistics, and adaptability. When the two met, it was not heroics alone that determined the outcome, but systems designed to endure chaos. The German officers who once mocked American planning learned, too late, that arrogance cannot substitute for structure. Their Atlantic Wall, their doctrines, their assumptions about the enemy, all had been rooted in experience, yet none could account for the scale, patience, and industrial power arrayed against them. A coastline dismissed as improbable became the fulcrum of history. For the men who landed under fire, for the civilians caught between artillery and liberation, the cost was immense. Thousands of lives were lost or shattered, yet a path was opened for freedom and the eventual defeat of tyranny in Western Europe. The war's direction was altered not by one brilliant stroke, but by countless small decisions executed with discipline, foresight, and tenacity. And in the quiet that followed, the smoldering ruins of bunkers, the empty beaches, the hedgerows scarred by combat, history paused to record a lesson. Certainty can blind even the most experienced, while preparation and resolve can transform uncertainty into inevitability. Normandy was not merely a landing. It was a demonstration of human ingenuity, endurance, and the power of foresight to reshape the fate of nations.